I am Laura Washburn, and I'm a member of the Emmett committee and a member of the English program. And I'm a person who always reminds you to turn your cell phones sound off, and your watches and all your devices. And not to be rude, okay. By which I mean like surfing the internet or okay. So the Victor J. Emmett Jr. Memorial Award and Lecture is sponsored by the Emmett family and the PSU English Department, and this year a little bit by the Distinguished Visiting Writer Series, which means also by the Student League Council. Once upon a time, at Pittsburg State, a man was hired, Victor J. Emmett Jr., had gone to Harvard, and he became the chair of the Department of English. Unfortunately, he died rather young, and his family endowed a lecture series to make sure there would always be high-quality scholars speaking to students at this university and for the English department. A committee each year chooses the Emmett speaker and the Emmett Award winner. They meet and discuss carefully, and sometimes they choose from essays published in the Midwest Quarterly, but sometimes we don't. This is a sometimes we don't here. And I heard our speaker, George Frazier, speak at the Kansas Authors Club, and I was like, well, here's kind of a Renaissance guy, right? Like, he was in the world of business and computers, working for a company named Cadence in Silicon Valley. So there's a whole, and now he's an assistant professor of computer information science at Washburn University, and yet he writes these wonderful books, which I'll talk about in a second. So with those things in mind, we decided to have him for our speaker this year. Dr. Frazier is an assistant professor of computer information science at Washburn University and a prolific author of nonfiction nature writing. His talk will share the title of his most recent book, Riverine Dreams, A Way to the Glorious and Forgotten Grassland Rivers of America. His presentation will focus on his exploration of the rivers and related ecosystems found throughout the central United States. His work explores the intersections of nature, history, and place. Lawrence magazine described Riverine Dreams as a love letter to the prairie and grasslands that make up North America. Journalist Max McCoy noted that Frazier expertly recounts the story of how humans and nature have rubbed shoulders along the banks of America's grassland rivers. His academic research includes work in artificial intelligence and environmental informatics. He is prominent in his field of scholarship. He is working on a new project that we will not discuss. And I am pleased to present you with the Victor J. Emmett Memorial Lecture.
Thank you. All right. That's great. Thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate it. Yeah, so, like Laura said, I'm not a professional ecologist, right? My training is in computer science, and when I was working my career before I came to Washburn, I worked for a company and we design software for people that design hardware. So that's mainly like people that build mobile phones, people that design like the hypercompute clusters for AI, LLMs, and for social media companies, people that design electric cars and self-driving vehicles. And so my background then is really heavy on writing code, right? And also writing now 2 books about the native ecosystems in the bioregions that I'm most familiar with, and the Midwest and the Great Plains. And so that means mostly prairies. Okay? So this map shows an approximate distribution of what we believe the native grasslands looked like at the time of Euro-American settlement. And so what you'll notice is that there's 3 main regions. I have them outlined in this red, jagged circle. So you have the short grass prairies out in the west. You have a region of mixed grass prairie in the middle. And then you have this long sort of tongue of tall grass prairie. And we're here in Pittsburg, Kansas, in the erstwhile realm of the tall grass prairie, out to the east, okay? And so these roughly correspond to moisture, rainfall, and temperature gradients, right? So even though the map has changed today, right? If you go to like southeastern or northeastern Colorado in the shortgrass prairie, there may be only like 13 inches of rain a year. But as you move east into Illinois, like where there's very little prairie remaining, but originally there was, you might get 40 inches of rain per year. Okay, so this is sort of the region of grasslands in North America. But there's another scientific name for it that's important to know. Okay, and that's flyover country. So you can see my expertly drawn red line is a perfect intersection of the prairie. So you know the Midwest is a funny place. This area was called the Great North American Interior Grassland, a dramatic name. And even today there are thousands of incredible wild places, wild landmarks, native forests, wetlands, and prairies across our region. But you know, relatively few people in the Midwest, or people that think about the Midwest, really note it for wild places. We're really not known for our wild places anymore, okay? But don't be fooled, people. The Midwest and the Great Plains played a crucial role in the environmental history of this nation, and we still have World Heritage quality natural areas in the form of ancient forests, wetlands that support vast migrations of birds, singular species like the whooping crane, and of course the unique American prairie itself with its legacy of the bison and all of the animals that depended on this incredible ecosystem. So I think some of this has just been the way we've been trained to think, okay? For a couple of reasons, relatively few people, even people who've lived their whole lives in this area, are familiar with these landmarks, like this incredibly diverse tall grass prairie that's kind of in the background of this slide that's very close to my house where I live in Lawrence, Kansas. But, you know, some of these places are no less biodiverse and ecologically important than redwood forests, coastal reefs, even equatorial rainforests, and they're no less endangered, okay? So I know this is kind of how I used to feel. So I grew up in a suburb of Kansas City called Overman Park. And I was interested in nature. My parents were really big gardeners, and I loved to be outside, but I didn't really think that we had wild places, right? If you think of that term. Having said that, though, I was in love with that idea, and I was in love with the American wilderness. And so in grad school, I used to, over the summer, somehow finagle my way so I could spend most of the summers out west. And so I spent time hiking in the Never Summer Mountains, in the Tetons, rode my bike from Seattle to San Francisco one summer, just camping along the way. And I was holed up in an apartment one summer, studying for my PhD qualifying exams in computer science. I was totally focused on that. But the roommates I was staying with, they were going to these protests where people were protesting the clear cutting of ancient redwood forests. And so people completely felt these connections to wild places in California and in the West. And Kansas was the place I sort of came home to study, right? But one summer, when this redwood stuff was going on, I came home and I had learned about this prairie called the Elkins Prairie. And it was an 80-acre example of what's called a deep soil prairie out on the outskirts of Lawrence. And so this is a little bit different than what we have in the Flint Hills, which are close, right? The deep soil prairies have very, very deep layers of soil, and so most of them were plowed up. So the deep soil prairies that remained were very rare. And the ownership of the prairie had recently changed hands from a long time ownership from this one family. And the prairie had, right about the time I found out about it, it had become embroiled in politics. And so Lawrence was going to build a road around the city. That's today, it's the South Lawrence Traffic Way, K10. And the land was right on this property. And so there was a lot of back and forth with the landowner about people trying to tell him what he could and could not do with his land. Right? Nature Conservancy and this Douglas County wanted to buy it. And we're in a state of private property, right? And so it was a very complex mesh of interactions. And in the end, I was driving by the prairie one day, just driving around, and I noticed there was a tractor in the field. And behind the tractor were big furrows of dirt. And I was a kid from Overland Park. I grew up by a mall, and I didn't know anything about farming. And so I went back to the geography department. I had a girlfriend at the time that worked there. And I said, hey guys, they're doing some sort of prairie management technique in Elkins Prairie. That was not happening. They were plowing the prairie up. And so the landowner got sick of this sort of back and forth and decided, if he plowed the prairie, this would be a moot point. So I went back to the site with some friends, and all these people were standing outside the Elkins Prairie. And what I realized then was this was a wild place that people felt strongly about, right here in my own backyard, just like people felt strongly about wild places out west. That was what really struck me that day. A lot of things happened because of that. There's a group in Kansas called the Kansas Land Trust, and it was formed basically with people standing in front of the prairie that day. There's a famous crop artist, Stan Kerr, that works here in Kansas. He was really influenced by that event. And it made me want to sort of lift the veil. I said, if there's Elkins Prairie, what other wild places do we have right here at home in Kansas? And I wrote this other book called The Last Wild Places of Kansas. It's 10 years old this month. That's amazing. My baby is growing up. And the basic premise of this book, it's not so much that it's about Kansas, but how do you sort of relate to wild places in a place where all of the land is privately owned, right? I'm not saying it's bad that it's privately owned, but 98% of Kansas is on private property. That's like inversely proportional to places where you can go roam out west, right? And so if you want to build sort of a personal connection to landscape, what do you do in the land of private property? So I tried to take on this question in this book. And I don't know that I completely answered it. And there's a lot of stuff in this book that the seed of it came from here in Pittsburg, Kansas, where I learned about river otters. But I didn't really, so this itch has continued with me. And so I realized there was another way to explore prairies in the land of private property, and that is on rivers. Okay? So really in the Midwest, and really anywhere, rivers are the gateways to the wildest lands that we're meeting. So here's a map that kind of overlays the rivers of the North American interior with this other kind of map that we saw, right? And so this purple area, these are the grassland rivers of America. Now, grassland rivers have some characteristics, okay? So they're kind of defined as the grassland, as rivers that flowed predominantly through areas that in pre-American settlement times were grasslands, okay? And these rivers have lower gradients than rivers in the mountains and other parts of the country, and so that means they flow through broad floodplains that are laced with oxbows and wetlands that support migratory bird corridors that stretch over 1,000 miles, and, strangely, migratory fish. They're prone to seasonal pulses of rain. Okay, so some were historically fed by snowmelt that would pulse out from the Rockies in about the time of the strawberry moon in June. Some are fed by an annual monsoonal pattern, like in northeastern New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, and all of them pretty much are affected by the thunderstorms that march across Tornado Alley in the spring. Because of the seasonality of rainfall, they tend to dry up. And because of drought and the lack of relative shade, because these are prairie rivers, right? So some of them have forest corridors, some of them are just prairies. So because of that, the fish and other animals that inhabit these rivers have to be incredibly tough. So if you take a salmon and just plunk it down in the Arickaree River up in northwestern Kansas, it will die. It will just die within like an hour, okay? So the fish that have evolved in grassland rivers have incredible adaptation systems to survive the challenges that they face in those rivers. So today, with the plowing of the prairies and the conversion to agriculture, grassland rivers face all sorts of assaults. Hydrological changes, right? Because water runs off much faster from farm fields than prairies. Channelization, because we have such good farm country, people have tried to maximize the arable land by like channelizing rivers. Pollution, of course, from fertilizer and pesticides. And in the Western Plains, we have a Great Plains version of the story that's going on across the entire American West with the mining of groundwater and the drying up of rivers. rivers, okay? But I think perhaps the biggest problem these rivers have is cultural invisibility. So just like the prairies have been strangely left out of the conversation of American ecosystems, grassland rivers, which have long been known as a category of river by environmental scientists, they just really haven't been celebrated at the public level, like other types of American rivers. I couldn't find a single non-academic book that kind of takes on grassland rivers as a subject. So that's kind of how my book came about, Riverine Dreams. And I'll read you just a little section from the introduction. So Steve Bubak, natural history biologist Steve Bubak, once told me that to affect environmental change on a prairie river, you must start at the top. So his statement stuck like a koan. The top of Bubak's River, the Grand of northwest Missouri, was a maze of small streams that dissected a kind of deep soil prairie that today is rarer than mastodon ivory. Restoring the river meant restoring prairies. Rivers and grasslands were yin and yang, a dual narrative, their fates inseparable. I set out to chronicle a type of American river whose story has never been told. Like the author William Lees T. Moon, who searched for the real America by driving roads that appeared as blue lines on old highway maps, I left to find the story of the prairie and its rivers by canoe. Because when it comes to exploring wild places, even the brownest river is bluer than the bluest highway. What I discovered is that across the Great Plains in the Midwest, a remarkable movement is underway at the intersection of grasslands and rivers. Nothing less than a grassland river revival. So this book is not memoir, it's science. Cultural history, natural history, science. I picked sections of 8 rivers that when combined kind of give us a contemporary picture, a snapshot of where grassland rivers are today, why they're important, what we can do to protect them and enjoy them. So one of the first questions I had is, what is a wild river? So I tried to pick relatively wild sections to get a sense of what these rivers could be, right? So what makes a river wild? One thing is dynamism, okay? This isn't a very big slide. If this was a big, giant slide, you would see this is the Yellowstone River taking out a part of a road. You do not want to build your house right next to a river like this, or a road. You also don't want to build your house maybe next to the Missouri River, because every 40 years it's going to unleash chaos in your backyard. So this is a shot of the Great Flood of 1993 near Jefferson City. You can have wild times on rivers, right? Party rivers in the Ozarks, those are not grassland rivers. There's not a lot of party scenes on grassland rivers. There is the Niobrara. Has anyone ever been on the Niobrara River in north central Nebraska? A little bit of an ecotourism scene there. There is the definition of wild that comes from the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, okay? And so the Act says that the wild rivers that are protected under that Act, they represent the vestiges of primitive America. What does that mean? I can't really get my head around that. What does the vestiges of primitive America even mean? It doesn't seem very satisfying to a guy that's going out to look for wild rivers. So there's another definition. So Ellen Wall is a noted fluvial morphologist, geographer at Colorado State University, and she uses this term connected river. And she describes connected rivers, those that are fully connected to their surrounding landscape and richly diverse in form and function. She's written that in a connected river, pools and riffles alternate downstream, and riverside vegetation forms a mosaic of different types and ages. During floods, water flows across the floodplain unimpeded by man-made structures. So that's kind of a definition you can kind of take to the bank, right? It's a functional definition. So connected rivers are wild rivers. And so it became pretty easy. So I'm not this great outdoorsman or anything, but I got in my canoe. I'm also a weirdo. I like canoes instead of kayaks. And I got in my canoe and I did a lot of paddling to prepare for this book, including the interviews I did, about 2,000 miles over the course of a few years. And it was easy to see which rivers were connected, like the parts of the upper Missouri, the Purgatory River of Colorado, the Niobrara River, for sure, connected. But when you start to see deeply incised banks, and a lot of dams, other changes, at least for now, those rivers are less connected. But I mean, In the end, though, it's all relative. You know, compared to downtown Pittsburgh or something, right? Pretty much any river is going to seem pretty wild. If you get in at the edge of any metropolitan area on its river and you head out a mile downstream, you're going to feel like you're in a different world. So, with no further ado, away we should go to the glorious and forgotten grassland rivers of America. So I'm about to show you some of the most unheralded gems in the entire American backcountry. So I would suggest that some of you guys take notes. I'm hoping that you visit at least one of these rivers sometime soon, even if you never intend to get in a boat. So we must start at the Missouri. Okay? The Missouri River is the mother of all grassland rivers. And I'm sorry, I know we have the Ark here in Kansas, and that's a great river, but this is the mother of them all. So for one thing, it's huge. If you consider the system of the Missouri along with the lower Mississippi as a single river, why not, right? That makes it the 4th longest river in the world. And even the section where it officially ends in St. Louis is 2,300 miles, 2,000 miles of which flowed originally through grassland. Okay? So it's an enormous thing. So let's zoom in. So a particularly dramatic section is called the Upper Missouri Breaks. And so it's a Great Plains badland, and it is astonishingly beautiful. This is near the Canadian border in north central Montana. So I mentioned the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. For about 100 miles here, the river flows through Upper Missouri Breaks National Monument, where it is a wild and scenic river. So if you have bucket lists that have rivers on them, this should be on yours. I'm kind of squeamish about bucket lists because I'm in denial about it. I'm kicking the bucket, but I had this on mine for a long time. So one way you can experience this river is to go to Fort Benton, Montana. It's a sort of wild westy town in the Great Plains. It's got this really cool old hotel you can stay in. There are many places you can walk up to the river. You can go see the Giant Springs State Park in nearby Great Falls. This is this huge spring that's 100 feet from the Missouri River, and that 100-foot section is considered the shortest true river in the world. It's also, though, a fantastic place to paddle if you have any skills at all. You can get completely outfitted in Fort Benton. People will drive you to the foot end, pick you up 50 miles downstream. It doesn't cost very much money. There are rattlesnakes, but you can do it. And it's a fantastic place to paddle. So here's a drone shot just below Coalbanks Landing, which is one of the places that I'll usually put in when I go there. And this has been described as the single greatest place to experience the Great Plains like they perhaps were 200 or 300 years ago. The breaks are famous for Lewis and Clark, so they have maps that you can take and go to the exact places that they camped. But it's also filled with older Native American landmarks. So I found many of these in the hills around the river. These are kind of teepee rings. I've seen the similar things along the Smoky Hill River here in Kansas. There is also an incredible park called First Peoples Buffalo Jump State Park, where there's a long mesa that occludes at the end, and people used to run buffalo off the edge and club them when they fell down, before people hunted buffaloes on horses with rifles. And so at one time, bison bones over like 1,500 years were stacked up, higher than a person. This area was preserved because of its unique geology. So the White Cliffs section has been painted by a lot of painters. Thomas Hart Benton went there. These are aquatints by Karl Bodmer, who traveled the river in the 1830s with a German prince. And really, to me, when I first got on the river, I looked at these aquatints and they almost seemed photographically accurate. So this is a picture of one of the formations. They really he did almost like the best photography you could do in 1830s technology, right? Here's some shots I took. This is called the Sentinel. There aren't very many cottonwoods in the breaks. They're trying to sort of have more of them, right? But the dead ones that are there, they usually have either a bald eagle, a golden eagle, or an osprey nest. And this is this very interesting geological formation called Shonkinite. And so this is where volcanic intrusions were sent up between softer rock. And if you look at the bottom, there's some Shonkinite there. So I kind of knew what it was before I got there because I looked at the paintings. And then when the water eroded, it it leaves these giant fences of this caramel-colored rock. Looks like fences for like dinosaurs or something, right? Now, what about the prairies? What about the prairies? My book is a book about prairies and rivers, both topics. So you really can't talk about the prairies of the Upper Missouri Breaks without mentioning this old idea called the buffalo commons. So this is Frank and Deborah Popper. They're urban planners from Rutgers University. And long time ago, in the 1980s, they wrote this paper, and they were studying depopulation of the Great Plains. They noticed that most counties in the Great Plains since the Depression had lost population, and they expected the trend to continue. Okay? Now, that's fine. They published the paper in this obscure to us, right, urban planning journal. It might have been a great journal, but unless you're an urban planner, you might not have read it, right? But they had a paragraph at the end that made the story go viral in the sense that a story about urban planning in the 1980s could go viral. And their suggestion was what should we do about this loss of population? The federal government should buy the entire Great Plains and repopulate millions of buffalo. And this was incredibly unpopular in the Great Plains. Because these guys were from New Jersey in one sense. And there was a congressman from Kansas, and he said that maybe the federal government should buy up the state of New Jersey and reintroduce wild boars because the idea is hogwash. But you know, this idea has never gone away. It's never gone away for buffalo commons. And so about 25 years ago, the World Wildlife Fund did a survey of the remaining prairies of the planet. And they identified north central Montana as having enough remaining never plowed prairie that it could support essentially like a world biosphere reserve, like in the African Serengeti or something, right? And so 23 years ago, a private company, organization, nonprofit, but I use the word company specifically, was called now it's called American Prairie, was formed. And they decided to try to create this 3.2 million acre preserve. This would be bigger than Yellowstone and Yosemite combined. And they have a unique technique. So they're not trying to build a national park. They're a private entity buying ranches as they become available. And the Poppers are not wrong. A lot of land becomes available in the Great Plains, and so American Prairie will buy it. And their goal is to create wildlife corridors that connect Upper Missouri Breaks National Monument and the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, which already have 1.2 million acres. Combine them together. And so far, American Prairie has bought 600,000 acres of land. And they're using this sort of Silicon Valley startup sort of idea of fundraising. Now you'd think that, so they want to reintroduce eventually 10,000 buffalo. And if you think about it, there were what, 30 million buffalo? I don't remember counting them in the 1800s, but they say 30 million buffalo, and we have 6 million cows in Kansas. So just in terms of just putting it in perspective, 10,000, not that many, but if you or I were standing by 10,000 buffalo, we'd say, man, that's a lot of buffalo. So you might think that a big buffalo buffet like that might lure some of the buffalo's original sort of predators down from the mountains. But the grizzly bears are not waiting on American Prairie. So they have been, over the last 15 years, repopulating parts of the reserve by the Upper Missouri Breaks. In the first return of grizzly bears to grasslands in North America since the mid-1800s. So some of the bears have actually had dens and produced young in the Great Plains. So this is an interesting emerging story. Now, it's a neat idea. The American Prairie Reserve is not very popular in Montana. It's incredibly unpopular amongst governors, states attorney generals, some of the ranchers. There are people on either side of this argument. There have been recent court cases that come down kind of against American Prairie. They also own a lot of leases on grazing rights on BLM land that comes with ranches when you buy them. And a recent court case said that you don't have the right to graze buffalo on public lands under the Taylor Grazing Act because they are not livestock. And so This is not necessarily, this doesn't, I mean, they own so much land, it doesn't necessarily affect them in a big way, but it's definitely an interesting story in the American prairies, and it's worth keeping an eye on. Okay? That's Missouri. So I want to tell you about two more rivers. So the Purgatory River is a completely different river, kind of river. And this is a river that is in southeast Colorado. And it starts in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and it emerges in the Great Plains in one of the most spectacular remaining sections of the Great Plains, Picketwater Canyon. Now first the name, okay? So can you, any of you guys speak French? How do you say this? If you're speaking in French.
Purgatoire.
Oh my gosh, I think that's the best I've ever heard in my talks. Thank you.
Not
And you
bad.
have it on tape, right?
Not bad for a Spanish professor.
I like it. That's so good. I'm not even going to try. But so that's, you know, that's what the name started with French. The, you know, the European name started with French. When the English-speaking people got there, they alliterated it to picket wire, which means nothing, right? And but for some reason the name stuck in the Picketwater Canyon. But maybe the name that gets the closest to it is the Spanish word, which means the river of lost souls. And at one point, some conquistadores disappeared along a branch of the Purgatory River, and so the river is thought to be haunted by their lost souls. It might not be too bad of a name for it, actually. So the river itself is mostly a shallow affair. I tried and failed spectacularly twice to paddle this river. It's more of a hiking place. So there are crossroads and trails that go along the river that have been there for thousands of years, and there are hiking trails that intersect some of those old trails. So this is a fantastic place to hike, and I'll show you the hike in a second. It's a very strange country, okay? It's been thought of as an inhospitable place for thousands of years. The archaeological record shows that there's really no permanent, long-standing settlements within the Purgatory Valley, basically ever. So the brutal Santa Fe territorial governor, Juan Oñate, he's the guy that was married to the great-granddaughter of an Aztec emperor, and he and his soldiers massacred the Acame Pueblo in northern New Mexico, and the order that he gave was to chop off the right foot of every surviving man over the age of 25. This guy was a bad guy. There was a statue of Oñate in northwestern New Mexico, and in 1997, right here, at night, somebody snuck out in and sawed off the right foot of the Oñate statue, and it was never found. So after the Mexican-American War, some people did immigrate from Santa Fe. They were trying to establish claims that would make it easier to adjudicate land ownership claims after the Mexican War. But they didn't last very long either, because there were a series of blizzards, and their settlements are still there, plain as day, and you can walk up to some of these in these hiking trails, and it kind of looks like they just got up and left, like the night before, because it's so dry. It's preserved things in incredible detail. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this book, Lonesome Dove, by Larry McMurtry. And there was, anyways, this is one of the great stories in Western writing, right? And the bad guy in Lonesome Dove is Blue Duck. And when they go to try to find Blue Duck, he kind of slips through their fingers. And the protagonist of the book, he says, you know, Blue Duck was living in the Llano Estacado. The Llano Estacado is the staked plains of western Texas. And this is where the desperados and the really bad dudes hung out, right? And they said Blue Duck went to the only more inhospitable place you could go than the Llano Estacado, and that's the Purgatory. So there's a great hike that you can do there. It's 6 miles down and 6 miles back, and it's almost completely flat. I'll tell you in a second why you want to go there. But there's this sign at the beginning, and this just doesn't seem like that big of a deal compared to hiking up a 14er. But it says, hiking into the canyon is optional, but hiking out of the canyon is mandatory. And they basically, this is pretty wordy. I would edit this if I was the National Park Service. But it basically explains that if you get heat stroke down in the canyon, you should go lay in the river and drink river water, because multiple people have died on this short little hike because it's just it has this microclimate that fools you. So I go on this trip every year there. We go in December though, so that it's not very warm there. So another interesting thing is that the fish in the purgatory have been sampled many times, and in these studies, over 99% of individual fish come from 13 native species in the purgatory, making it probably the wildest remaining fishery in all the Great Plains. And that's because it's, again, if you put a salmon in the Purgatory River, it's not going to survive. So the canyon walk, it's close to La Junta, Colorado, but not that close. You have to basically drive on 30 miles of dirt road, and then it's in Comanche National Grassland. And the reason people do this hike is to see dinosaurs. So it's really incredible. You get to the end of the hike, and the river has eroded away an ancient lake bed. And this is the largest dinosaur track site in North America. So these are the footprints of like brontosaurus, those giant dinosaurs of yore. And so there's a paleontologist who, Martin Lockley, he's the University of Colorado, Denver. He just passed away a few months ago. But I talked to him many times about this site. This site made him famous in his field, which was basically dinosaur psychology. And so the idea is that bones are bones, you know, but footsteps sort of, they tell you about behavior. And so they could look at these families of dinosaurs that were kind of out for a walk one night, right? And there's a little one that's sort of moving in and out, and two adults walking side by side. And so, you know, he really sort of immortalized this in the studies of dinosaur tracks. Another reason you might, maybe not me, visit the Purgatory is because they have an annual tarantula migration. I'm just not big into the idea of tarantula migrations. But I have gone to see it because I read a book on grassland rivers. And you can take, you know how you can turn your headlight onto the red setting, you know? You put it out into the prairie, and you see all of these eyes. It's so weird. So this is Hank Guarisco. Anyone know Hank? He's a spider researcher. He lives in Kansas. And this guy told me that he can drive, and I think he was talking about Crawford County, actually. He was driving in Crawford County one night, but he can do this anytime, apparently. And at highway speeds, he will see a wasp flying, and he will stop his car, he will go on foot, chase the wasp, and it will lead him to a tarantula. Because there's a kind of wasp called a tarantula hawk. And it's this bright red, and it's got black wings. It's this beautiful creature. And what they do, though, is kind of dicey. They paralyze the tarantula by stinging it, and then they fly it back to their nest. And then the female lays the eggs on the spider. And so they're all ready with a meal when they wake up. And then it goes off to being a nice wasp, just dining on nectar, right? But Hank actually looks really, really young for his age. And he's like, he went to Woodstock. And so my wife thinks that he said that he's been bitten 100 times by black widow spiders. And maybe somehow this is his answer for youth or something. But so I've read that another entomologist says that if you get stung by this wasp, the best thing to do is just to lay down and scream. Because it's one of the most painful insect bites in nature, but it doesn't really do any harm. So this is the tarantula hawk. It's the state insect of New Mexico. So maybe it's not a tarantula migration. It's all the males emerge at the same time, but it's close enough for La Junta. They have an annual tarantula migration festival. And when I was speaking in Fort Collins in the fall, there were some people that had road tripped from the tarantula festival to see my book talk, which I thought was great. They had tarantula swag with them. It was great. Okay, so I won't keep you guys much longer. I do want to mention a river closer to home. Okay, so man, we have some great rivers here in Crawford. We're in Crawford County, yeah. And in my first book, I have a chapter called The Renegade Streams of Eastern Kansas. And I talk about, we have really weird river access laws here. The only 3 rivers you can legally float are the Kaw, the Missouri, and the Ark. Otherwise, you need permission from every landowner on both sides of the river. It's a strange system we have here in Kansas. And many of those, what I think of as renegade streams, like the Marmaton and other streams. There's so many good rivers right around here. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Kaw. So the Kaw is at once a shortgrass, mixed grass, and tall grass prairie. It starts officially at Junction City and goes to Kansas City. This is a great resource we have here. You can go paddle the Kaw. It moves along at about 3 miles per hour. There's no whitewater. The Kaw has probably the greatest sandbar camping of any place, I think, in America. And so you can get a sandbar completely to yourself. You can build campfires you can see from the moon. I like this map. So this shows the Kaw connected to the Smoky Hill, and it goes out into Colorado, and it doesn't start in the mountains. So this makes, the Kaw actually turns out to be the longest true grassland river on Earth. And that means a river that runs completely through grasslands without mountains or anything for its entire length. Just trivia, river trivia, what's that mean, right? It's the winter. But the headwaters, the longest, the farthest point away from the mouth is the headwaters of the Oricary. And if you ever go to Denver, I don't know how you guys would go to Denver if you live here in Pittsburgh. I drive I-70, and I go through Lyman, Colorado. And if you're ever in Lyman, there's a cedar break north of Lyman, and the headwaters is up in those trees. And if you get off the road and go up there are always a group of pronghorn antelopes that kind of guard the head of the Kaw River. So when I'm on the Kaw, I think of the guardian antelope that are looking after the river. So what about the name, right? Kaw. So Kaw is an honorarium for the Kaw people, right? And Kansas, the name Kansas, also, comes from the name of the Kaw people. And they lived along the river at least back into the 1600s. They haven't been in Kansas as long as, say, the Pawnee, right, or the Wichita tribe, Caddoan-speaking people. But the Osage and the Kaw people, they moved here, mid sort of 1500s, around then. But they didn't call the river the Kaw. They didn't name it after themselves. They probably named the river, they probably called it different things at different places, but they definitely called it Topeka Creek. Topeka Creek. And the name comes from the Dahiga, I can't say the word, Siouan word for timsala, or the prairie turnip. And so this was an important foodstuff that grew in the tall grass prairies. People are calling it timsala now. So Topeka Creek, Topeka kind of means good place to dig potatoes. They call it the Kansas River too. But when I was growing up, my grandma called it the Kaw. She grew up near it. Everybody calls it the Kaw. I talked to Don Bueller from Friends of the Kaw. I said, why don't we just rename it the Kaw? That's what everyone calls it. And so, I don't know. I don't know if it's a good era to be renaming big bodies of water. Okay, so this is my boat, The Getting to Nowhere. So this is one of these sandbars. So I really encourage you guys to take advantage of the Kansas River or the Kaw River. I looked a lot into the cultural history I talked about in the book. So this is Abe Burns and Jake Washington. They were the pioneers of this era of commercial fishing in the Kaw. So in the old days, if you wanted to eat fish in Kansas, you either had to catch it yourself or buy it, right? You didn't have salmon flowing here. And so in Lawrence, for about 6 miles downstream from Lawrence, on a summer night, you could see lanterns of commercial fishermen fishing the river. And Abe Burns would fish from the Bowersock Dam. He would dive into the river and into the churn of the dam, and it would kill any of us. I don't care how strong of a swimmer you are. You would die if you did that. And I'm going on record as saying, don't do this. But he would lash a gaff onto his fist, and he would wave it around in the churn and hook huge catfish, and he would get to the bottom where the centrifugal force would shoot him and the fish downstream. And like 50 or 100 people would gather every day to watch this go on. Now, these commercial fishermen eventually kind of became outlaws because they outlawed commercial fishing. And one of the last commercial fishermen was Tom Burns. And late in his life, he wrote, in an explosive bout of exposition, he wrote a 60-page, basically, accounting of his years on the Kaw in 2 days. And this is in the Spencer Museum archives at the University of Kansas. And I've gone and photocopied this thing and taken this with me on river trips. And one thing he told about was Now, he supposedly spent almost every day on the river for 50 years, but only once, on one spot in the river, on a summer night in June, he saw an incredible migration of flathead catfish, like 100-pound fish that were basically playing in the river like dolphins. And he describes it as thousands. And he wouldn't tell anyone where this was. But I'm pretty sure I know where it must have been. And so I've gone there in June and parked my boat there, awaiting migrating catfish. And I've seen one or two, but I've never seen thousands of them. Not far from this point is, here's some pictures of mine from the call that I've taken over the years. And these are some shots from an article I wrote in Canoe and Kayak magazine. But I can't finish this story without talking a little bit about river otters, especially since we're here, where I first sort of got into river otters. Once I wrote The Last Wild Place of Kansas, I learned about how to find river otters from a student, Marcus Jones, here at Pitt State. And he took me to river otter school one day, and we drove all over the county looking at river otters. And after the book came out, I mean, I don't know anything about river otters, but I kind of became a river otter guy. And people would email me every week, pictures of river otters, some of which were river otters, some of which were other strange things. And for this book, so see, I've still only seen a river otter in Kansas briefly for a second. The reason that we were kind of into them is after I met Marcus Jones, we came back to Lawrence, and my daughter and I were in the Pascal Baker wetlands, and we saw these tracks, and Marcus had showed me how to identify otter tracks. And I knew they were river otters, but at the time, there was no evidence of river otters in Douglas County, probably since the 1800s. And so the wetlands manager let us put a motion-activated camera up, and we got a picture of river otters. And so the photo was like in newspapers and stuff. And that kind of made me an infamous river otter god. Now, in this book, one night I was camped at the mouth of Stranger Creek on the Caw, and it was a terrible night to camp. Because I, for some reason, camped near the trains, and they were just going back and forth like tools of psychological warfare as I tried to go to sleep. There were some fishermen. It was the night of a huge mayfly hatch. So the whole sandbar was coated with bugs trying to get in my tent. And some fishermen were anchored, and they came up right next to my sandbar at 1:30 in the morning and started talking about their marital problems. And one guy was trying to get a home equity loan to go to a Tony Robbins conference. And I do not need to know that information. But I was trying to sleep in a tent on a river. And but finally they went away, and the whole place became silent, and I heard river otters running around my tent like a trap. And so I quietly tried to unzip the tent, and they heard it, and it was like plop, plop, plop. So I didn't see them, but their tracks were everywhere. So river otters in Kansas continue to have fun at my expense. So I appreciate you guys listening to my talk. I will only mention quickly that I want to remind you the Missouri is the mother of all grassland rivers, okay? But the lower Missouri from Kansas City to St. Louis is a very different river. It's been channelized. Most of the prairies have disappeared in eastern Missouri, where it becomes sort of the cradle of grassland restoration, and I tell that story in the book. There are lots of great places to experience the lower Missouri. The Saline County was maybe the most prairied county in Missouri history, but there is very little reminiscence of it in the county. They even have a park for a 1930s era psychic dog. This is true. And this dog apparently predicted like 7 presidents who won the election 7 times in a row. But they don't have any prairie parks. So if you want to experience the Missouri River, there are various places you can float it. But you can also join the MR340 Ultra Marathon Canoe Race, which is this incredible event. It starts in Kansas City and goes to St. Louis. It goes across the entire state of Missouri. And you have to finish in 88 hours. And so that means you need to kind of paddle all day and all night. So I did this. And again, I'm not this great paddler, but it turns out to be surprisingly doable. It's a hell of a lot easier than the Appalachian Trail, for example. And all you have to do is basically be willing to suffer. and you can finish this thing. So my wife was my quote-unquote ground crew for this. We didn't really know what we were getting into. And I'm just going to finish by reading you the small section. This is about my experience on the third night of the MR340 as the sun was setting. And racers on the race tell the story of a mass hallucination that they have on the third night of the race. And I had not heard about this at the time. And but things definitely get strange. So in Herman, the river town settled by German immigrants who founded a Missouri Rhineland, Christina, that's my wife, met me with an entire pizza. An entire pizza. This cemented her celebrity with the other paddlers who shared it. After a 25-minute stop, I launched against the backdrop of the setting sun for one last push to New Haven, 17 miles downstream. Night paddling, I was finding out, could be tricky. The previous night, I'd had trouble under the I-70 bridge at Rocheport, where algebraic currents caused by huge girder beams that almost twirled me. Later that night, a paddler flipped in a whirlpool, the kind you can hear. He managed to grab his kayak and reach shore with the help of another paddler, but sank to his waist in mud and quicksand while hundreds of mosquitoes bit his face. But after I cleared the bridge, the next hour had been magic. I had joined with 2 other boats for safety. We watched as a Neolithic moon emerged on the brink of fullness and poured out like honey over bluffs in a scene too beautiful to ever describe with words. Bats flickered across the water in terse patterns, skimming mosquitoes and katydids. Moonlight permeated our empty cargo holds and illuminated paddles, clothing, and dry bags like a twinkling linen. One of the guys in the other boat flashed on his headlamp for an instant, and Luna moths circled like a halo of forest nymphs. Where the green starboard lights shone through the top 2 feet of river, gar with crocodilian teeth rose from the murk, attracted the shiners that swam toward the light. Time seemed to stop as our boats continued along with the current in total silence. We were 4 regular guys with day jobs, less than 2 miles from one of the busiest highways in America, astounded by sights that few people had ever seen. We broke the soft water with our paddles only when we had to, taking care not to disturb the dreamscape on this greatest of grassland rivers. But tonight was different. I'd never felt so alone on a river, and not in a liberating way. As the last glint of twilight faded, I heard a sound like rushing water, which got louder, and eventually it seemed like I was surrounded by waterfalls. In Herman, we had studied maps, and I thought that a tricky spot on the river, Burger Bend, was beyond New Haven. I'd misread the maps. A large rock spire splits the river at the bend. At night or in fog, paddlers must avoid the sheet on river left at the end of the island. Some spent maddening hours paddling in circles around the rock. I knew to stay in the middle of the river and relax. There are no waterfalls in Missouri. Despite radiant moonlight, the forests were sloping black pools of darkness. The river had narrowed and deepened. My paddle slicked through black boils 6 feet across, rising like smoke rings from the depths in the fastest water of the race. Then things got weird. Suddenly, it seemed perfectly rational to stand up in the boat and walk toward shore. The river looked like blacktop, asphalt. I knew the thought was madness, but it kept clawing at me. Faces came next, monkey faces, poking out between branches of trees in the dense woods. The trees became menacing. Walking from the canoe across the riverine parking lot seemed like beautiful peace. What was in that pizza? So thank you. Any questions?
Have you been on the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon?
No, I haven't. Have you?
Yes.
Oh,
Thanks to the National Humanities Council seminar
Okay.
out on the East Coast, and then we had a huge trip to Arizona,
Oh,
and we
how
went
fun.
all the way through the Grand Canyon.
Oh, I've done the Green River, which joins up with the Colorado.
Yeah,
Oh
and
my God.
spent the night there and did it all in 2 days. It was
Oh,
an
fabulous.
absolutely amazing experience. Lots of geology that I still appreciate to this day as in Arizona.
Yeah. Have you read the John McPhee book? There's
Yeah.
a great book about the geology. Any other questions? How many of you guys are English majors?
all these English majors, that's great. So we have a reception where people will have a chance to talk to you, and are the books?
The books are still for sale in the back of the governor's room.
And then the reception is across from the governor's room in the heritage room. And there's good looking charcuterie and pinwheel sandwiches and dessert. So you'll get a chance to
Thanks for coming, everyone.
get a book signed. Together.
Thank you for rescuing me.
You're welcome.
I was hurrying after a rehearsal. I didn't know what I was doing.
I saw you and I'm like, wait, I know where he's trying to find.
Yeah, there's a couple of 90 studies.
Probably just leave you this for a second.
I want to meet the dinosaur psychologist.
Yeah, he died 2 months ago. It's
Okay, yeah, I think Kyle did that hurricane or sea. Yeah, Kyle cited those.
Hello, Paul.
Hello. I made it.
There, you made it.
Gotta be in two places at one time.
Thanks for being here and recording that.
Thank you.
Yeah, like my